Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into your sources on how 18th and 19th century literature and identity weren't just concepts that evolved over time.
No, they were actively engineered, really,
Yeah,
constructed.
exactly. And our mission today is to sort of take apart the machinery behind that, how it shaped our understanding of, say, what a poem meant or what the ideal woman was supposed to be.
And even huge concepts like the Oriental, this massive imperial idea, how it was, well, manufactured.
Precisely. We're moving beyond just, reading the text themselves.
Right. If you really want to get a handle on this, you have
Yeah.
to understand it's not just about summarizing famous works. It's about analyzing how the physical thing chimes, the material existence of an idea.
Like the actual book a poem was in.
Yeah, or even a social role definition. How that physical form was politically used, politically manufactured right from the get-go.
Okay, so we've got a really interesting structure for this deep dive. We'll start small, looking at the surprising politics behind Romantic poetry. Then we'll broaden out to how social roles, specifically motherhood, were deliberately constructed.
Right, get calculated.
And finally, we'll tackle that big one, the systemic construction of entire civilizations using the framework of Orientalism. So let's unpack this first part.
Yeah.
So when we talk about Romantic poetry, Coleridge, Keats, we usually think timeless themes, right? Nature, big emotions, the lone genius poet.
That's the common view, yeah.
But our sources, looking at work like Magnuson's, they really insist we have to place these poems right back in the moment they were first published.
Absolutely crucial.
Which means considering the physical object itself. The paper, the font.
The typeface, the price, the title page, definitely. And maybe most importantly, the publisher, their political leanings, their prestige, or lack thereof. Yeah, the point is that the poem's actual container, the book or journal it appeared in, was always part of its message, its politics.
So not just words floating free, but a physical thing in a specific political world.
Exactly. It was an artifact placed deliberately. And when you put that material context back, well, the meaning can really shift.
Okay, give us an example. How does a poem we think we know change when we sort of put the original book back on the shelf in our minds?
Well, take Coleridge's This Lime Tree Bower My Prison. Reads today like a very private, personal reflection on being stuck inside, looking at nature.
Right. Solitude, nature, seems pretty straightforward.
When it first came out in the annual anthology in 1800, that specific publication context changed everything.
How so? What was the annual anthology?
It was known for publishing dissenters, thinkers connected to radical politics at the time, people challenging the status quo.
Okay. So just by being in that anthology, the poem, even if it wasn't overtly political.
It immediately picked up that political charge. It was taking a side, implicitly.
Interesting.
And the poem also has these references, almost like codes, to his friend Charles Lamb. In 1800, given the radical links of the publication, that gave the poem this strong political edge.
An edge, we completely miss reading it in a modern collection.
Totally miss it. It's a perfect example of how the material context shapes the imagined world of the text itself.
That really does raise a fascinating question for you listening. If we ignore the physical book, its original place in the world, are we actually missing the original political argument?
We very well might be. Or take Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn,
Yeah,
cornerstone of Western art,
absolutely.
but where it was published. Super important. It came out in the Annals of the Fine Arts.
And that publication had a particular stance.
Oh, definitely. It explicitly rejected the artistic standards and the authority of the Royal Academy. It was anti-establishment in art terms.
Okay, so Keats choosing that journal wasn't just finding a place to print his poem. It was like joining a debate, entering the politics of taste.
He absolutely was.
Mm-hmm.
Placing the Urn poem there, with critics like Hazlitt and Hunt championing taste outside the royal institutions, it was an implicit challenge to authority. The poem, through its publication, was arguing for artistic liberty, putting art into a new, maybe more democratic politics of aesthetics. The physical setting, the journal, changed what the poem did for its first readers.
So the core idea here is authority, working through publication, actively shapes the art. Now let's take that same idea, that force of manufacture, and apply it to identity itself.
Good transition.
Because the same kind of forces that decided where Keats published were also busy deciding what a good woman should be.
Exactly. Moving from the physical text to the construction of social identity, we see very similar engineered ideals. We often tin the really repressive domestic ideal on the Victorians, right?
Yeah, that's the stereotype.
But the sources show the key parts of that middle-class virtuous mother ideal were being pushed and pushed hard much earlier. We're talking late 17th century.
Wow, that early. So what exactly did this manufactured ideal demand from a woman? Because you mentioned the list is intense.
Oh, it was incredibly prescriptive, very specific, non-negotiable things like, quote, all-engrossing tenderness.
Okay. Tenderness.
And long-term maternal breastfeeding, personal supervision and education of young children, plus complete physical restriction to domestic space.
Confined to the home, basically.
Totally. And this is crucial. The ideal also required the absence of sexual desire and withdrawal from productive labor.
Wow. So tender, homebound, focused only on kids and piety, and completely desexualized. Okay, if this wasn't just happening organically, who was pushing it? Was it like a government decree or more subtle?
The sources suggest it was more tied to the rising middle class trying to define itself, assert its moral high ground over, say, the aristocracy on one side and the working poor on the other.
Okay, making themselves distinct.
Right, and to really hammer home that narrow new ideal, they need a contrast, a cultural other. And that's where the monstrous mother trope comes in.
The nightmare version, the anti-ideal.
Precisely. And this wasn't just hinted at, it was actively promoted in art and stories back then. Think of Hogarth, his famous picture in Gin Lane.
Oh, yeah. Horrific. The drunken mother dropping her baby.
Exactly that. It served as the stark opposite, meant to terrify middle-class women into conforming to this new, very moralistic maternal ideal, which was increasingly seen as separate from politics or economics, purely domestic, purely moral.
Which sets the stage perfectly for Mary Wollstonecraft, who was pushing back hard against this engineered role.
She was.
And she wasn't just talking about individual rights, was she? The sources frame her as a moralist connecting the dots between family power dynamics and national politics.
Yes, seeing the home as a mini political state, basically, a microcosm of injustice.
And her way of arguing was pretty unique for the time.
Absolutely. Her whole methodology was powerful. She flat out rejected the common idea back then that a woman writer had to have personally lived through something to write about it convincingly.
Ah, the right what, taken to an extreme limit for women.
Exactly. She rejected that and insisted on arguing from a broader cosmopolitan sociopolitical reformist standpoint. She argued for universal human rights for everyone, but she rooted that argument in the specific injustices faced by women.
So using the particular oppression of women, the critique of patriarchy, as the very foundation for a universal claim.
Precisely. It was sort of flipping the usual approach on its head, which often just ignored women's specific situations to talk about abstract ideals.
Okay, so we've seen how publication context shapes a poem's politics, and how literature and social forces define roles like mother. Now let's scale this up massively.
Right.
Applying this mechanism of construction to, well, an entire civilization. This brings us to Edward Said's framework, Orientalism.
A really crucial critical concept.
Defined here as a cultural and political institution for dealing with what the West called the Orient.
Yes. Said defines Orientalism in these sources as fundamentally a Western discourse, a way of talking, thinking, and writing that was used for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient.
So not just studying the East, but a system of power.
Exactly. It's a discipline of power.
Yeah.
And it hinges on this key concept Said calls exteriority.
Exteriority. Okay, what does that mean for us, for the listener, in practical terms? How did that work?
Well, exteriority basically means the Western perspective is always outside, looking in. The West translates the Orient's reality, but only through its own lens, for its own purposes.
So the Orientalist, the scholar, the traveler, the poet, they make the Orient speak. They explain its mysteries.
But always for the West, to the West. The Orient gets contained, represented, turned from something potentially unknown or threatening into, as Said puts it, a kind of theatrical stage affixed to Europe.
Right. An object to be known and managed, essentially stripped of its own voice. And this imaginative geography, as the sources call it, it wasn't just academic, it had a very real political job to do, right?
Yeah.
Justifying imperialism.
Oh, absolutely. The source material highlights rhetoric from figures like British leaders Balfour and Lord Cromer. They actively created difference through their words to justify colonial rule.
What kinds of things did they say?
Well, they described Orientals Arabs, specifically in Cromer's case, as, quote, devoid of energy and initiative, inveterate liars, and having minds eminently wanting in symmetry.
Wow. And this was contrasted directly with?
With the supposedly rational, logical, noble Anglo-Saxon race. It's a classic colonial move. Define the other as everything you claim you are not.
Defining by opposition.
Exactly. And this reliance on these pre-baked ideas, these supposed differences, leads to another key concept, the textual attitude.
Textual attitude, meaning
Meaning the Orient often became less a real place with real people and complexities and more a collection of references, a topos, pulled almost entirely from previous Western texts about the Orient.
so writers and even policymakers were relying more on books than on reality.
In many cases, yes. They drew on this existing library of approved written knowledge rather than, say, direct unbiased observation.
That's kind of mind-blowing. You mean actual policy decisions could be based on essentially literary myths?
It seems so. For instance, the sources mention Napoleon's plans for invading Egypt. Apparently, they were significantly guided by ideas and myths he'd culled from texts, not from up-to-date empirical knowledge of Egypt at the time.
The text created the reality he expected.
In a sense, yes, which leads to some really telling moments when reality inevitably clashed with the textual fantasy.
Right, like that fantastic anecdote about the French writer Gérard de Nerval.
Oh, it's the perfect example of this clash. Nerval travels to the region, completely primed by European literature to expect some kind of, exotic, erotic harem fantasy.
Right, the standard European trope.
But then he actually investigates, asks questions, and he's totally shocked to find out that women in the Egyptian viceregal harem had significant legal rights.
Legal rights?
Like the right to demand a divorce if their husband tried to bring in a second wife. They had recourse.
So Nerval walks in expecting, I don't know, a scene from a pulp novel.
And instead finds basically a family law seminar, a system of rights that just shattered the whole European narrative of the enslaved, purely sensual Eastern woman.
Yeah, the complex legal reality just completely undermined the simple, constructed image Europe preferred. It revealed complexities the Western textual attitude had basically erased or ignored. And this way of thinking, this textual attitude, this habit of constructing difference, it didn't just stay in foreign policy discussions about the Orient.
No, fortunately not.
It bled into Western social debates, too, even into early feminism, creating some really problematic internal hierarchies.
Yeah, we see this overlap very clearly in Harriet Taylor's really influential 1851 essay, The Enfranchisement of Women.
What did she do?
Well, Taylor basically laid out a hierarchy of women globally, and it mapped perfectly onto British imperial thinking at the time.
How so? What was the hierarchy?
At the bottom, she put savage, tribal women described as slaves just for physical toil. Next up were Asian women designated as slaves purely for sensuality.
And at the top, presumably.
European women, naturally, specifically British women, implicitly.
So she used the very logic of Orientalism, the constructed difference, to argue for the superiority of Western women.
Absolutely. She described Asian women as inherently servile-minded. She claimed their customs had hardened them against degradation, basically deadening the part of their nature which would resist it.
Wow, and the consequence of that kind of thinking?
Well, the consequence was pretty profound. It provided a neat justification for the whole imperial civilizing mission. British women, being superior, supposedly had a duty to save their poor, degraded Indian sisters.
Reinforcing empire under the guise of feminist concern?
Exactly. It's a stark example of how these constructed categories intersected and reinforced each other.
This whole deep dive has been incredibly revealing. It shows whether we're looking at a romantic poem or the definition of motherhood or how an entire civilization was framed, that history isn't just things happening. It's about authority, publication, empire, actively creating the categories, the very ideas we study now.
The material conditions who got published where the political needs of the moment, the drive for self-justification, they gave these concepts their shape, their power, their feeling of authority.
Yeah.
And that really is the lasting insight from these sources, I think. The sheer resilience of these constructed ideas is, well, it's quite something.
It really is.
And it leaves you with a pretty provocative question to think about, doesn't it? If so much of the knowledge we've inherited about art, about society, about entire cultures, was actually produced as a strategy, for power, for justification.
Right.
Then what widely accepted truths about our own time, what fundamental ideas we take for granted right now about society or about other groups might need their own deep dive, might need us to dig into their material and political origins.